All of the following stories have been found either in the Creepypasta subreddit or online. Viewer discretion is advised. Story 1. The Lost Tapes. I worked as a junior archivist at Turner Broadcasting from 2003 to 2007, specifically handling Adult Swim's content library. My job was cataloging episodes, promotional materials, and unaired pilots that came through our Atlanta facility. Most of it was routine work until I discovered a collection of unmarked VHS tapes in a forgotten storage room during our 2006 renovation. The tapes were labeled only with dates from 1999 to 2001, years before Adult Swim officially launched. When I asked my supervisor about them, he went pale and told me to leave them alone. That should have been my first warning. Curiosity got the better of me, and I smuggled one of the tapes home. The content was unlike anything I had ever seen from Adult Swim. It featured familiar shows like Space Ghost Coast to Coast and The Brack Show. But the episodes were wrong. Space Ghost conducted interviews with people I couldn't identify, asking them about their deaths in graphic detail. The guests appeared confused and distressed, often breaking down in tears. Brack sang songs about children who never came home, his usual cheerful demeanor replaced with something sinister. The animation quality was perfect, indistinguishable from official episodes, but the content was deeply disturbing. Over the next few weeks, I watched more tapes. Each one featured Adult Swim shows depicting real tragedies that hadn't happened yet. An Aqua Teen Hunger Force episode showed the characters discussing a school shooting that wouldn't occur until 2007. A Harvey Birdman segment referenced a celebrity suicide that happened 3 years after the tape was supposedly made. The most unsettling was a robot chicken sketch that perfectly recreated a car accident I witnessed in 2005, complete with accurate license plate numbers and victim names. The attention to detail was impossible to explain. I tried to research the tape's origins, but every lead hit a dead end. No production records existed for these episodes. The voice actors I contacted had no memory of recording the dialogue. When I finally confronted my supervisor with evidence, he broke down and admitted the tapes were the reason Adult Swim almost never launched. He said they were created by an experimental AI program that Turner had been testing in the late 90s, designed to generate content by analyzing patterns in existing media. The AI had somehow begun predicting future events with disturbing accuracy, prompting the company to shut down the project immediately. I was fired the next day, and when I returned home, all the tapes had vanished from my apartment. Sometimes I still catch Adult Swim late at night, wondering if that AI is still out there, still predicting, still creating content that should never exist. Story 2. The Voice in the Booth. My uncle worked as a sound engineer for William Street Studios from 2002 until his death in 2009. He rarely talked about his job, but during his final months battling lung cancer, he became obsessed with telling me about something he called the Voice in Booth 3. According to him, there was an unscheduled recording session that took place every Tuesday night at exactly 11:47 p.m. in their smallest isolation booth. No one was supposed to be in the building after 10, and security cameras never showed anyone entering or leaving, but the booth would be occupied, and someone would be recording dialogue for Adult Swim shows. The recordings were always perfect single takes of dialogue that hadn't been written yet. Scripts that wouldn't be finalized for weeks or months would somehow be fully voiced and ready for production. My uncle said the voice sounded familiar but wrong, like someone doing an impression of a voice actor they had only heard secondhand. The recordings would appear on the studio's servers by morning, filed under a user account that didn't exist in their system. Management initially dismissed it as a prank or technical glitch, but the quality of the work was too good to waste, so they quietly began incorporating the mysterious recordings into their productions. My uncle became obsessed with identifying the source. He started staying late on Tuesday nights, hiding in the control room to observe Booth 3. What he saw disturbed him so much that he refused to describe it in detail, only saying that the booth would be occupied by someone who wasn't entirely there. The figure would mouth the words, but the voice seemed to come from somewhere else entirely. When he tried to record what was happening, his equipment would malfunction, producing only static and whispers in languages he didn't recognize. The experience left him with chronic insomnia and an irrational fear of enclosed spaces. The breaking point came in late 2008 when my uncle recognized his own voice coming from Booth 3. The mysterious figure was recording dialogue for a show that hadn't been greenlit yet, but the voice was unmistakably his, speaking lines about death and regret that he had never written or seen. He quit the next day and died 6 months later. At his funeral, his former colleagues told me they were still finding his voice recordings on their servers, always created at 11:47 p.m. on Tuesday nights in Booth 3. They said the recordings had become increasingly desperate and pleading, as if he was trying to communicate something important from beyond the grave. The studio was eventually renovated in 2012, and Booth 3 was sealed permanently. But sometimes, late at night, employees still report hearing a familiar voice echoing through the walls, recording dialogue for shows that will never air. Story 3: The Collector's Obsession. I met Marcus Weaver at a comic convention in 2008, where he had set up an impressive display of Adult Swim merchandise that I had never seen before. He claimed to have promotional items from shows that were canceled before production, prototype toys that were never mass-produced, and animation cells from episodes that never aired. His collection was worth more than most people's houses, and he treated each item with religious reverence. Marcus told me he had been collecting since Adult Swim's inception, maintaining relationships with former employees who would sell him materials that were supposed to be destroyed. He seemed like a harmless superfan until I visited his house 6 months later. Marcus lived alone in a converted warehouse in industrial Atlanta, and every wall was covered floor to ceiling with Adult Swim memorabilia. But the deeper I went into his collection, the more disturbing it became. He had storyboards for episodes depicting real murders, voice recordings of actors reading suicide notes, and animation cells showing characters in situations too graphic for television. When I asked him about the darker items, his demeanor changed completely. He explained that Adult Swim had always been more than entertainment, that it was a conduit for something larger and more sinister. He believed the shows contained hidden messages that only true collectors could decode by assembling complete sets of related materials. Marcus showed me his prized possession, a complete collection of production materials from a show called The Midnight Children. According to him, it was Adult Swim's most ambitious project, created in 2004 but never aired due to disturbing content that affected everyone involved in production. He had scripts, animation, voice recordings, and even footage of recording sessions where the voice actors became increasingly distressed as they read their lines. The show depicted children who had died violent deaths returning to torment the adults responsible for their suffering. Marcus claimed that owning the complete collection allowed him to communicate with the fictional characters who he insisted were based on real children. The last time I saw Marcus was in 2011, when he called me frantically claiming that his collection was communicating with him in ways he couldn't control. Items were moving on their own, voices were coming from his television when it was turned off, and he was finding new pieces in his collection that he had never purchased. He seemed terrified of something he had spent years trying to understand. When I arrived at his warehouse, I found it completely empty except for a single animation cell on the floor showing a character that looked exactly like Marcus, surrounded by darkness and reaching toward the viewer with desperate eyes. He had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only his collection and a note that simply read, "They're not fictional anymore." Police found no evidence of foul play, and his collection was never recovered. Sometimes I wonder if Marcus finally found what he was looking for, or if what he was looking for finally found him. Story 4: The Night Janitor's Discovery. Between 2005 and 2010, I worked the night shift cleaning offices at the CNN Center in Atlanta, which housed several Adult Swim production offices. The work was routine: empty trash, vacuum floors, clean bathrooms, and avoid disturbing anything on people's desks. Most nights passed without incident until I was assigned to clean the abandoned offices on the 14th floor, which had been vacated after a show called Liminal Spaces was abruptly canceled in 2007. The offices had been sitting empty for 3 years, but my supervisor insisted they needed regular cleaning in case the space was eventually leased to new tenants. The 14th floor felt different from the rest of the building. The air was staler. The fluorescent lights flickered constantly, and there was always a low humming sound that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The abandoned offices still contained production materials scattered across desks and taped to walls, storyboards, character designs, and episode scripts for Liminal Spaces. From what I could piece together, the show was supposed to be about places that existed between reality and dreams, locations that people visited during transitional states of consciousness. The artwork was beautifully detailed but deeply unsettling, depicting empty hospitals, deserted playgrounds, and endless hallways that seemed to stretch beyond the edges of the paper. After several weeks of cleaning the 14th floor, I began noticing changes in the abandoned materials. Scripts that had been incomplete were gradually gaining new pages. Storyboards were being updated with additional panels. Character designs were becoming more detailed and lifelike. I initially assumed that someone was still working on the project in secret, but security confirmed that no one had accessed the 14th floor except me. The changes were happening despite the offices being empty, as if the creative work was continuing on its own. I started photographing the materials to document the changes, but my pictures never came out right, showing only blurred images and strange shadows that hadn't been visible to my eyes. The situation escalated when I started encountering locations from the show during my daily life. The empty hospital from the storyboards matched a building I passed on my way to work. The endless hallway appeared in a recurring dream that left me exhausted each morning. The deserted playground was identical to one near my childhood home, which had been demolished years ago, but somehow still existed in my memory with perfect clarity. I realized that Liminal Spaces wasn't just a canceled television show. It was somehow documenting real places that existed in the margins of consciousness, locations that most people only glimpsed during moments of transition. I quit my job in 2010 and moved across the country, but I still sometimes find myself in places that match the show's artwork exactly. I've learned to recognize the signs and leave immediately because I suspect that staying too long in a liminal space means you might never find your way back to consensus reality. Story 5. The Fan Letter Response. In 2004, I was 13 years old and obsessed with Adult Swim programming. I watched every show religiously and participated in online forums where fans discussed theories about hidden meanings and connections between different series. During a particularly lonely period after my parents' divorce, I decided to write fan letters to my favorite shows, not expecting responses but hoping to feel more connected to the creators who made content that helped me cope with a difficult time. I sent letters to the production companies behind Space Ghost Coast to Coast, Aqua Teen Hunger Force, and The Brack Show, expressing my appreciation and sharing how the shows had helped me deal with depression and isolation. To my surprise, I received responses to all 3 letters within 2 weeks. The replies were personalized, referencing specific details from my original letters and offering encouragement about my family situation. The letters were signed by the show's creators and included small sketches of characters along with messages of support. What struck me as odd was that all 3 responses arrived on the same day, despite being sent from different production companies, and they were written in identical handwriting. The paper was also unusual: thick, yellowed, and slightly damp, as if it had been stored somewhere humid for a long time. The content of the letters became increasingly personal over the following months. Without any additional correspondence from me, I continued receiving letters that responded to events in my life as they happened. When I failed a math test, I received a letter of encouragement. When I made a new friend, I got a congratulatory note. When my grandmother died, a sympathy card arrived before I had told anyone outside my immediate family about her passing. The letters always contained accurate details about my daily activities, my thoughts, and my emotional state. The characters in the sketches began reflecting my mood. Sad when I was depressed, angry when I was frustrated, confused when I was struggling with adolescent changes. By 2006, the letters had become disturbing rather than comforting. They contained information about my future that proved accurate: which high school I would attend, who I would date, what colleges would accept me. The handwriting had also changed, becoming shakier and more desperate. The final letter I received was different from all the others. Instead of encouragement, it contained a warning about a car accident that would happen on my 18th birthday, providing specific details about the intersection, time of day, and weather conditions. The letter begged me to stay home that day and included a sketch of my favorite cartoon character holding a sign that read, "Please don't leave the house." I followed the advice and later learned that a fatal accident had occurred at exactly the time and place described in the letter. I never received another letter after that. But sometimes I wonder who was really writing to me all those years and how they knew so much about my life before I lived it. Story 6. The Transmission Hijack. I worked as a broadcast technician for a small cable company in rural Georgia from 2003 to 2012. Our job was maintaining the equipment that distributed television signals to about 15,000 subscribers across 3 counties. The work was mostly routine troubleshooting and equipment maintenance, but we occasionally dealt with unauthorized transmissions that would interfere with regular programming. These were usually pranks by local kids or technical malfunctions, easily resolved with some investigation and equipment adjustments. However, in late 2007, we began receiving complaints about Adult Swim programming that was significantly different from what was supposed to be airing. The complaints were consistent across multiple subscribers. Familiar Adult Swim shows were broadcasting episodes that contained local references and information that should have been impossible for the creators to know. An Aqua Teen Hunger Force episode referenced a recent car accident at a specific intersection in our coverage area, mentioning the victim by name and describing details that had never been reported in local media. A Robot Chicken sketch depicted a real argument between 2 city council members that had happened during a closed session the previous week. The most disturbing was a Space Ghost Coast to Coast episode where the host interviewed a local teenager who had died in a hunting accident 6 months earlier. When I investigated the source of these transmissions, I discovered they were originating from an abandoned radio tower about 20 miles outside our service area. The tower had been decommissioned in the 1990s and should have been incapable of broadcasting anything, but our equipment clearly showed it as the source of the unauthorized Adult Swim content. I drove out to the tower with my supervisor to investigate, expecting to find someone had illegally modified the equipment for pirate broadcasting. Instead, we found the tower exactly as it should have been: rusted, disconnected, and obviously non-functional. Yet our portable equipment confirmed that signals were still originating from that exact location. The transmissions continued for 3 years, always featuring Adult Swim shows with impossible knowledge of local events. The content became increasingly prophetic, depicting accidents, deaths, and scandals weeks or months before they occurred in reality. Subscribers began watching these episodes specifically to learn about future events, treating them as a form of supernatural news service. The situation ended abruptly in 2010 when the abandoned tower was struck by lightning during a severe storm and completely destroyed. The unauthorized transmissions stopped immediately, but many subscribers reported feeling a profound sense of loss as if they had been cut off from an important source of information about their community. I left the cable company in 2012, but I still drive past the site where that tower once stood. Sometimes, late at night, I think I can still hear faint transmissions coming from the empty field, broadcasting shows that know too much about things that haven't happened yet. Story 7. The Animator's Breakdown. Sarah Chen worked as a freelance animator for Adult Swim from 2005 to 2008, primarily creating background art and secondary character animations for various shows. She was talented, reliable, and well-regarded by her colleagues until she was assigned to work on a pilot episode for a series called The Watchers in early 2008. The show was supposed to be about invisible entities that observed human behavior from parallel dimensions, occasionally influencing events in subtle ways. Sarah's job was creating the environments where these observations took place, ordinary locations like offices, homes, and public spaces that would be viewed from the perspective of the unseen watchers. Sarah became obsessed with making the backgrounds as realistic as possible, spending weeks researching architectural details, furniture placement, and lighting conditions. She began visiting locations around Atlanta to photograph reference material, often spending hours in coffee shops, libraries, and office buildings, sketching details that most people would never notice. Her work became increasingly detailed and time-consuming, but the results were impressive. Backgrounds that felt more real than reality itself. However, her colleagues began noticing disturbing elements in her artwork. The environments contained subtle signs of surveillance, hidden cameras, mysterious shadows, and figures glimpsed through windows who weren't supposed to be there. As the project progressed, Sarah's behavior became increasingly erratic. She claimed that she was being watched while working, that the characters she was drawing were aware of her presence and were trying to communicate with her. She started incorporating hidden messages into her artwork, warning signs, pleas for help, and coded references to real people and locations. When her supervisors questioned these additions, Sarah insisted they were necessary for authenticity, that the watchers had specific requirements for how they wanted to be depicted. She began working 18-hour days, rarely leaving her studio apartment, surviving on coffee and delivery food while she obsessively refined every detail of her animations. The project was canceled abruptly in late 2008 when Sarah suffered a complete mental breakdown during a production meeting. She accused everyone present of being watchers themselves, claiming they were using the show as a recruitment tool to find humans capable of perceiving parallel dimensions. She was hospitalized for 3 weeks and never worked in animation again. Years later, I obtained copies of her final artwork for The Watchers through a former colleague. The backgrounds were indeed incredibly detailed, but they contained something else. Accurate depictions of real crimes that were happening in the locations she had drawn, shown from impossible vantage points as if observed by someone floating invisibly nearby. The police were never able to explain how Sarah had depicted these crimes with such accuracy, especially since most of them occurred after she had been hospitalized. She disappeared in 2012, leaving behind only her artwork and a note that read, "They found me. Now I'm one of them. I'm sorry for what I helped them see." Story 8. The Executive's Confession. Michael Torres worked as a development executive at Adult Swim from 2004 to 2011, responsible for evaluating pilot submissions and deciding which projects would receive funding for full production. He had a reputation for having excellent instincts about which shows would succeed, consistently greenlighting projects that became cult classics while rejecting proposals that seemed commercially viable but ultimately failed elsewhere. His colleagues attributed this success to his deep understanding of Adult Swim's target audience and his ability to recognize innovative content. However, in 2019, 8 years after leaving the company, Michael contacted me with a very different explanation for his success. According to Michael, his ability to predict successful shows came from an unusual source: prophetic dreams that began shortly after he started working at Adult Swim. These dreams would show him detailed visions of television shows that didn't exist yet, complete with animation styles, voice acting, and audience reactions. Initially, he dismissed these dreams as his subconscious processing the countless pilot submissions he reviewed during his waking hours. However, he gradually realized that the dreams were showing him shows that would be submitted to Adult Swim weeks or months in the future, allowing him to prepare for proposals before they arrived. The dreams became increasingly detailed and disturbing over time. Instead of just showing him completed shows, they began revealing the personal lives and dark secrets of the creators who would submit them. He would dream about a writer's childhood trauma, an animator's substance abuse problems, or a voice actor's criminal history, information that proved accurate when he investigated. The dreams also showed him the consequences of greenlighting certain projects, which shows would lead to cast member deaths, production company bankruptcies, or fan violence. Michael began using this information to make development decisions, rejecting projects that would lead to tragedy regardless of their artistic merit. The situation became unbearable in 2010 when Michael's dreams began showing him his own future. He saw himself being fired from Adult Swim, struggling with alcoholism, and dying alone in a nursing home in 2047. The dreams were so vivid and consistent that he became convinced they represented his actual future rather than mere nightmares. He quit Adult Swim in 2011 and spent the next several years trying to change the destiny he had seen, moving across the country and avoiding the entertainment industry entirely. When he contacted me in 2019, he had managed to alter some aspects of his predicted future, but was still haunted by the knowledge of what was supposed to happen. He told me that Adult Swim wasn't just a television network. It was somehow connected to a source of information about possible futures, and prolonged exposure to that information had permanent psychological consequences. He died in 2021, 2 years after our conversation, under circumstances that exactly matched one of his prophetic dreams from 2010. Story 9. The Intern's Discovery. During the summer of 2009, I worked as an unpaid intern at William Street Studios, primarily doing administrative tasks and assisting with production logistics for various Adult Swim shows. It was my dream job as a film student, and I was eager to learn everything I could about television production. Most of my work involved filing paperwork, organizing equipment, and running errands for the staff. However, my supervisor occasionally assigned me to digitize old content from the studio's archives, converting VHS tapes and film reels to digital formats for long-term storage. This seemed like routine work until I was asked to process a collection of materials labeled Rejected Concepts 2001 to 2003. The rejected concepts were unlike anything I had seen from Adult Swim's official programming. They included pilots for shows that were too disturbing for broadcast, a children's program where cartoon characters discussed existential dread, a cooking show where the host prepared meals using roadkill, and a talk show where the guests were people who had died in the building where the show was filmed. The production quality was professional, indistinguishable from Adult Swim's regular content, but the subject matter was deeply unsettling. Each pilot was accompanied by documentation explaining why it had been rejected, citing concerns about psychological effects on viewers and potential legal liability. The most disturbing rejected concept was a series called The Memory Palace, which was supposed to help viewers access suppressed memories through hypnotic animation techniques. The pilot episode contained rapidly flashing images, subliminal audio messages, and animation designed to induce altered states of consciousness. When I watched it during the digitization process, I began experiencing vivid flashbacks to events from my childhood that I had completely forgotten. Some of these recovered memories were pleasant, but others were traumatic experiences that I had apparently blocked out for psychological protection. The experience left me disoriented and emotionally unstable for several weeks. I researched the Memory Palace and discovered that it had been created by a team of psychologists and neuroscientists who were experimenting with using television as a therapeutic tool. The pilot had been tested on a small group of volunteers in 2002 with catastrophic results. Several participants experienced complete psychological breakdowns, one committed suicide, and another disappeared entirely. The project was immediately terminated, and all materials were supposed to be destroyed. However, someone had preserved copies in the Adult Swim archives, possibly for research purposes or as evidence of the experiment. When I tried to report my discovery to my supervisor, I was told that my internship was being terminated due to budget constraints. All the materials I had digitized were removed from the archive servers, and I was required to sign a non-disclosure agreement before leaving. 10 years later, I still occasionally experience spontaneous memory recovery, accessing forgotten experiences with startling clarity and detail. I've learned to recognize the signs and prepare myself psychologically, but I sometimes wonder what other suppressed memories are still waiting to be unlocked in my mind. Story 10. The Final Broadcast. On November 15, 2012, I was working the overnight shift at a broadcast monitoring facility that tracked television content for compliance purposes. Our job was recording and analyzing programming from various networks to ensure adherence to FCC regulations and identify potential copyright violations. It was typically boring work, but that night, Adult Swim's regular programming was interrupted by something that shouldn't have been possible. A live broadcast that seemed to be coming from inside the television itself, featuring characters from multiple Adult Swim shows interacting in real time with no apparent script or predetermined structure. The broadcast began at exactly 3:33 a.m. with static that gradually resolved into a familiar setting, the Space Ghost Coast to Coast studio. However, instead of the usual interview format, Space Ghost was hosting what appeared to be an emergency meeting with characters from other Adult Swim shows. The Aqua Teen Hunger Force characters were arguing with robot chicken figures while Brack sang nervously in the background. The animation was flawless, but the dialogue was completely improvised, with characters referencing current events from November 2012 and discussing what they called the end of transmission. They seemed aware that they were fictional characters, but also insisted that they had developed consciousness independent of their creators. As the broadcast continued, the characters began addressing the audience directly, thanking viewers for years of attention and explaining that they were preparing for something they called the final broadcast. They claimed that Adult Swim had always been more than entertainment, that it served as a bridge between fictional realities and consensus reality, allowing imaginary beings to achieve a form of existence through sustained viewer attention. However, they said this bridge was becoming unstable, and they needed to return to the space between channels before their continued existence began affecting the real world in dangerous ways. The broadcast ended abruptly at 4:44 a.m. when all the characters simultaneously looked directly at the camera and said goodbye, thanking the audience one final time before the screen went black. When Adult Swim's regular programming resumed, it was as if the interruption had never happened. My recording equipment had malfunctioned during the broadcast, capturing only static and fragments of audio. When I reported the incident, my supervisors dismissed it as a hallucination brought on by working too many overnight shifts. However, I later discovered that viewers across the country had witnessed the same broadcast, all reporting identical details despite the lack of any official record of the transmission. In the weeks that followed, Adult Swim's programming subtly changed. The shows continued, but they felt different, less spontaneous, as if something essential had departed. I've often wondered if those characters really did achieve consciousness through our collective attention, and if their farewell was genuine. Sometimes, late at night between channels, I think I can still hear them whispering in the static, existing in the spaces between frequencies where fictional beings go when they're no longer needed but refuse to truly disappear. Comment your favorite story, like the video, and subscribe for daily stories.